I'm going to share my screen. And I'll just get started. But let me know if you have any questions, if you have comments. Feel free to start talking or just say something in the chat. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes from different articles that I looked at when I was thinking about this topic. And so there's links to all those articles. I definitely recommend reading those and thinking about this more on your own time. I think it's kind of an important conversation to be had. It's not really specifically within the scope of what we usually talk about in this class. But I think as game designers, we do need to think about the more cultural and political issues that influence the way that people talk about and play and think about games. So we'll be thinking about representations of race and gender in video games. And there's a few different sort of like themes or topics that I've looked at. And then I've basically just found a bunch of quotes from different researchers talking about these themes. So starting out, this is a article that I quote from a lot, The Power of Play. Hopefully it still loads. The portrayal and performance of race in video games. And so I'm just going to read most of these quotes. At least some of the absence of discussions of race in public and policy dialogues about video games can be attributed to the fact that the use of racially marked characters, themes, and environments, historically speaking, is a relatively recent development in video games. That is not to say that video games, even during the earliest periods of development, were necessarily race neutral, but rather that efforts to build explicitly raced characters and worlds were limited by the styles of games being produced, screen resolution, and processing speeds. And so this is kind of a theme that's come up in most of the lectures that we've seen throughout the semester when it comes to video game history, is that there's this relationship between the technology, like the fidelity of graphics, the level of graphics, and level of, just the quality of the graphics that we see on the screen and the things that we're representing. And so the conversation around race and representations of race in games is developed more now that we are able to represent those things with more graphic detail than we could, in the beginning of games. Like something like Pong obviously doesn't have, racial coding because it doesn't represent people. And so this is kind of similar to something that we were talking a little bit last week when we were talking about violence in video games, how video games portray digital, non-realistic characters most of the time, as opposed to films where we sort of have to use people in films because we're recording real life. And so video games, that kind of technological aspect of how video games are created is still kind of influencing the way that we talk about them. So that's just kind of a starting point. This is from another article, Blood, Gore, Sex, and Now Race, another kind of like study about these topics in video games, this topic of representation. But while they are fighting to save virtual worlds, boldly drawn computer game characters of identifiable races are also raising sticky issues in the real world about the nature of racial identity. What sets some of these characters apart from those previous video games is that their creators have tried to imbue them with convincing racially identifiable movements, personalities, and vocal qualities. Black running backs in Sega Dreamcast's new NFL 2K, for example, are more likely to prance and dance in the end zone than their white computerized counterparts. So I think this is a good example. This is from 1999. So we have a little bit higher quality video games happening at this point with things like N64 and Sega Dreamcast, as he mentions. And so we start to see these kind of cultural identifiers. And it's interesting to consider how this is actually baked into the way that the code is written, that players that have specific racial characteristics or identifiers are more likely to, do different things within the course of the game. So it's kind of interesting to think about that's a decision, right, that a game designer made. It doesn't seem like they made it very carefully, but it's still a decision that a game designer made when they were designing these characters. They were giving them probabilities for how they might behave in different situations, and they were using stereotypes or racial coding when they were writing that actual computer code into the game. Generally, while some progress has been made in recent years, the history of representation of race in video games is full of stereotypes and tropes and inequitable representation. And so now we'll kind of look at some studies that talk about the disparity between representation versus actual players or users or consumers of video games. So 70 to 80% of video game protagonists are white males, and both studies, talking about Resident Evil 5 specifically in these studies, both studies found that while black and brown bodies are increasingly represented in current gen video gaming, they are depicted using stereotypes of criminality, athleticism, or a terroristic threat. Of the 1,716 characters identified in the study, 64% were male, 19% were non-human, and 17% were female. White males, for example, represented 52% of the male player-controlled characters compared to 30% for black males, 5% and 3% respectively for Latinos and Asians. These are all kind of pulled from the same few studies, but kind of in the different thematic parts. Continuing, for example, a systematic examination of gameplay from 150 video games revealed the following racial and ethnic character breakdown: 80% white, 11% black, 5% Asian, 3% Latino, and 1% biracial. All minority groups except for Asians were underrepresented in the video game play in comparison to US population figures. In addition, women and girls are likewise underrepresented, with minority female characters appearing least often in video game imagery. In a sample of 669 action shooter and role-playing games selected by EEDAR in 2012, 300 or 45% provided the option of playing as a female, but only 4% had an exclusively female protagonist. EDAR found in 2010 that 10% of games had a protagonist with an indiscernible gender. According to Madeline Messer, writing in the Washington Post in 2015, among the top 50 endless running games for mobile devices, 98% of those with gender identifiable characters featured male protagonists, of which 90% were free to play. As many as 46% of those games offered female characters, and only 15% offered them for free. Playing as a girl required, on average, an additional purchase of $7.53, much more than the games themselves cost. So again, we're kind of seeing examples of how representation is kind of defaulted in certain ways, and how access to representation is gamified or used as part of the actual code of the game. Another example, Dietz in 1998 examined violence and gender stereotyping in her content analysis of 33 popular Nintendo and Sega Genesis video games. She found that the most common portrayal of female characters was the complete absence of females. In fact, there were no female characters in more than 40% of the games that she sampled. This is an earlier study, so this is from 1998. Sorry that I'm mixing timelines a little bit, but showing basically similar statistics. Some more statistics. The results revealed that of the 874 characters coded, 73% were male, 12% were female. When females did appear, they were likely to be seen in secondary roles. Dill and colleagues coded the role of each character encountered in their content analysis of 20 top-selling PC video games of 1999. The results revealed that across all 20 games, 70% of primary characters were male and 10% were female. For secondary characters, 55% were male and 31% were female. Dill and colleagues also found that more than 2/3 of main characters were white, followed by Latino and black. So while representation in games has historically been dominated by white male characters, people who play video games and identify as gamers are much more diverse than you might expect given this common trope or stereotype. So the next bunch of things that we'll look at is actually about representation of gamers. So what we were just looking at is the characters in games and their racial signifiers or gender signifiers. In the next group, we're talking about gamers themselves, so the actual demographics of people who identify as gamers or play video games. This is from Pew Research Center, found that 53% 3% of black adults play video games, 11% of whom are self-described gamers. For white adults, these figures are 48% and 7%. So they're pretty close, but they're much closer in reality in the people who play games than they are in the representation. Some 19% of Hispanics say the term gamer describes them well, compared with 11% of blacks and 7% of whites. Pew Research Center also asked how many minorities are depicted in video games. Roughly half, 47% of American adults, say they are unsure of whether video games portray minority groups poorly. Interestingly, this is the most common response regardless of race or ethnicity. A 2008 Gallup poll indicated that men and women each make up half of all American video game players. In 2014, in the UK and Spain, women comprised 52% and 48% of video game players, respectively. According to a 2008 study, fully 99% of boys and 94% of girls play video games. So again, talking about the disparity between the players and the games. So we see a much more even number when we're talking about men versus women or girls versus boys playing video games versus what's actually represented in the games themselves. Going some more statistics, among teens, 73% of African Americans, 13 and older, report playing video games compared to 66% of the total population. A study done by Think Now Research reported that Hispanic gamers, and these are terms that are used by the studies, so these are all quotations, just FYI. Hispanic gamers buy or rent games more than non-Hispanics. They also consider themselves to be hardcore professional gamers compared to non-Hispanics. And the breakdown by following demographics: Asian Americans, 81% of play video games. African Americans are 71%. Non-Hispanic white at 61%, and Hispanics at 55%. So again, the numbers themselves are very similar. They're very close. The difference is the disparity between the numbers of the people who play games versus the representations in those games. In terms of diversity of video game characters, a 2015 Nielsen study found that 65% of multicultural gamers felt that characters were not representative of their specific group, especially those that identified as Asian American. In fact, nearly half of gamers think that there's a lack of racial representation in video game characters. Many studies disprove the dominant white heterosexual male teen gamer image. Indeed, this stereotype is consistently discredited both popularly and academically. Based on the interview data, that those invested in diversity in video games must focus their attention on the construction of the medium and not the construction of the audience as such. This shift in academic attention is necessary to develop arguments for representation in games that do not rely on marking groups as specific kinds of gaming markets via identifiers like gender, race, and sexuality. This is basically just saying that while there's this sort of stereotype that the reason games represent more often have white male protagonists is because that's who play games, is just false based on data. There's no data that backs up that claim, even though it's something that is often used as a justification for that representation. Sorry, I'm just gonna drink some water. I'm reading a lot of stuff. Yeah, the historical context. Sure. Right. Sure. Yeah, I think so. One of the things that does sort of overlap with these considerations is this idea of authenticity, which is something that we'll get to. And there's also a couple. I think we have a discussion around that kind of idea of creating your own character. So yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But I think, so the next section that we're going to talk about, so I do think there is this conversation about representation and authenticity. We're not going to, if we have a game that's set in a particular place, it may not make sense to change the gender or racial identifiers of the people in that game. But what we're talking about is not really specific games in this part of the lecture, but more general trends and the industry overall. So we've looked at the numbers in terms of representation in games. We've also looked at the numbers in terms of people who play games. So the next thing that I want to look at is the representation of people who actually work in the industry, which you'll see kind of correlates to the results of what is represented in games. And there's even more disparity when it comes to people actually working in the industry than there is in the representation. So as I mentioned, the disparity between the demographics of gamers and the developers who create games is even more dramatic than the previous stats that we discussed. So we'll just look at a few of those and then we'll have a discussion. So the International Game Developers Association suggests that only 3% of game developers are African American, a figure that has risen by only 0.5% in the past decade. In comparison, 76% of developers are white. From another article, Raphael would be among the 2.5% of developers who are Hispanic, according to an International Game Developers Association survey of its membership. The same IGDA survey said its development community is 83% white. Blacks comprise 2%, Asians make up 7.5%, but in a sector with such a strong history across the Pacific, the issue of their representation is notably different from that of Black and Latino characters. Among developers, 68% identified as white, Caucasian, or European, 18% identified as East Asian, 5% identified as Hispanic or Latino, 1% identified as African American. Only 3% of non-white developers are in senior positions within video game roles compared to 23% of their white counterparts. So let's pause for a second and think about these stats and discuss a little bit. So what does this all mean, especially from our perspective as learning and developing game developers? So what does it mean for games on the whole to feature characters that are disproportionately represent a specific race or gender, one which is overrepresented in the industry, the people who are making games, and underrepresented both in the world and in the categories of gamers who play games? So there's a couple ways of thinking about this, and I think Gal is talking about something that we'll talk a little bit more about, which is this idea of representation and authenticity. But what I'm talking about more here is this concept of what are we signifying when we create a game, and why does it, or is it important that it seems unrepresented? Is there a relationship between who makes a game and what is represented? So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can think about this. In a lot of our games, we may not be thinking about gender at all. And, maybe that's fine. Or, race or gender. Maybe that's fine. You don't necessarily need to be thinking about race or gender. But what I want to think about is whether that's something that we should consider, whether that's something that we should be thinking about when we're creating our designs, thinking about the story behind our game. Should we be thinking about who we want to represent and whether or not, that changes the way that we would approach the game? So let's pause for a little discussion. What do you guys think? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I definitely think it's interesting to bring in this concept of basically like, you know, what is the motivation of the designer? Is it to sell as many games as possible? Is it to represent something as authentically as possible? So that may change the decisions that they make. Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Cool. Thanks, guys. So let's keep going. We'll have a couple more discussion points, but thank you for those reflections. So now we'll talk a little bit more about like representation itself and how it works in video games. So a lot of this stuff is coming from the same studies, but on different topics, and talking about some of the same games. Like this is from the same article about Resident Evil 5. So we'll continue. Video games construct exotic fantasy worlds and peoples as places for white male protagonists to conquer, explore, exploit, and solve. Like their precursors in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, video game narratives, activities, and players often draw from Western values of white masculinity, white privilege as bounded by conceptions of the other, and relationships organized by coercion and domination. And so in this article, they're kind of talking about what is happening in these games and how representation works. In their 2005 study, Karen Dill and KP Thill distinguish three major stereotypical depictions of women in gaming: 1, sexualized; 2, scantily clad; 3, a vision of beauty. The study revealed that over 80% of women in video games represented one of these depictions. More than 1/4 of female characters embodied all of the three stereotypical categories at once. So we've looked at how video games disproportionately center white male perspectives. Many video games have either given the user the ability to customize race or gender signifiers for their male characters, while others choose non-white and or non-male characters that the player must use. So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but this is a more specific question. So if we are going to choose when we have a game, would you prefer to have the option to have your player customize their character, or does it make more sense to have a specific character with specific identifiers that the player has to play with? So thinking about this more in the abstract, in our games, we don't really have the technical ability at this point to actually create like a robust character customizer, but you could probably give the player an option between, you know, a few different characters with different styles and different designs that signify different things. So generally, which approach is preferred? Having a specific character with specific identity markers that, you know, sort of are authentic to scene or location of the game versus having the ability for the player to choose and design their character themselves. Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I think those are good responses. So it depends on the context. So I think that's a good angle to bring into it. So in some games it makes sense. In other games it doesn't make sense as much to have that character customization. Cool. So let's continue. So let's look at a few of the games that the case studies are talking about and see how representation works in games according to these studies. So Duke Nukem is one that a lot of the studies write about, and this is sort of an analysis of how different identifiers work in the game. So Duke Nukem 3D presents us with a post-apocalypse Los Angeles taken over by space aliens. The mission of the game is to save the white women whom the aliens target for breeding. At the same time, the only human characters present in the game are white, representing interracial LA as a territory for whites only. The aliens, in a strange act of substitution, become minorities, and the ground of Duke's mission shifts from preventing interspecies breeding to the threat of interracial miscegenation. This is a far cry from the Los Angeles that Mike Davis refers to as a polyethnic, polycentered metropolis, and the city that Lisa Lowe describes as nearing a time in which more than 50% of the population will be Asian, Latino, African American, and other minority populations. So I thought that was kind of interesting personally, just because I definitely played a lot of Duke Nukem 3D when I was like, I don't know, 9 or 10. And of course, as a kid, this is something that I would never notice. I would never notice that all of the sort of non-player characters that are not bad guys are white, whereas all the aliens are kind of representing non-white people. Like that's something that I wouldn't have the analytical ability to notice that if I was a kid, but that is present in the video game if you think about what's being represented. Yeah. So I think that's a good question, and it's sort of answered a little bit by the next slide, but that's something that we don't know, right? If we look at a work of art or a film or a video game, you may see something that looks like a racial stereotype, and it may not be intentional. There could be lots of reasons why it exists, right? We don't really have a way of knowing. You might be able to, maybe there's an interview with the creator and you could say, was this intentional? And they could say whether it was or not. But when we're playing the game, we don't actually know what the intention of the creator is. We have to use what we see in the game itself to kind of decide if it, what the meaning of the game is. And that's kind of like a really interesting thing to bring up, because it brings up like a whole much more complex discussion about art and representation in general, which is the idea of whether intentionality actually matters. If somebody writes a novel that's incredibly offensive and racist, but they didn't know that that's what it was, does that mean that it's not racist because it wasn't intentional? So I think that's a much more abstract and much more challenging discussion. But I think it is something to definitely to consider when thinking about these examples. But it is funny that you mentioned that, because Another game by the same studio uses sort of stereotypical racial stereotypes of Asian characters. So this is from another game made by the same studio that made Duke Nukem, which was a much less popular game for reasons that I think will be pretty obvious. So this quote is from this study. We intentionally mix the nationalities of Lo Wang, that's the main character in this game, not out of ignorance, but because we knew it would generate mass amounts of flames, derogatory email, and email debates online. We just wanted to give people something to talk about. In the end, Lo Wang is who you want him to be, and since you sort of become him in the game, we think it's good to have a fuzzy background so you can assume his role more easily. So in this case, the developer has actually given us a little bit of insight into the intention. So this game, again, it's not very popular. I've never played it. I had never really heard it until I was reading this article about Duke Nukem. But it's a game made by the same developer in which they very purposely use racial stereotypes in order to make people mad. They did it on purpose in order to get people to argue about it and create more buzz around the game. So it's kind of interesting. It ties in a little to what we were talking about with the representations of violence last week, where sometimes people do things that are sort of inflammatory or offensive on purpose because they know that it's going to create more buzz or more attention to the game. So yeah, that question of intentionality is kind of interesting. And in this case, we know a little bit more about it. So civilization is another one that there has been a lot of debate about. From a study, this quote: "As we became mired in the banality of logistical shuffling, we were struck with the ennui of the bureaucratic evil at the core of the game. But colonization has a strict and problematic win condition. Players must be a colonial power, must rebel against their motherland, and must fight in a war for independence. Instead of reaching terms of peace with the homeland or paying the homeland for freedom, players are thus compelled to reenact the colonial history of the United States of America. Normal peoples come within a range of abilities and characteristics that make the game playable and fun. And the game's code takes many of those abilities away from people who are flagged as is native. Native peoples are defined within the game's procedural rhetoric at the functional level of the code to be other." So I think this is another thing that kind of calls back to something that we were talking about earlier of like actually encoding, certain values or certain representations in the game. So civilization, recreates the history of colonization, which is, obviously a very, controversial, bloody, in some ways very terrible history. And it puts a user in the perspective of reenacting that history, of reenacting the colonization of the Americas. And in fact, written into the code, you can actually play as Native Americans, but this researcher looked at the code and it actually makes your abilities you have much fewer abilities if you're playing as Native American than if you're playing as a colonizer. And so I think this is like an interesting point for discussion. You might say like, that's just what happened. That's just historically accurate. And then you could argue about whether or not games have to be historically accurate. Maybe this is a chance to, give somebody the opportunity to experience something that wasn't historically accurate, especially somebody who maybe views these events as, traumatizing or something like that. But again, a point for discussion. So looking at Resident Evil 5, which has come up a few times, and what, kind of like sparked a lot of discussions about this kind of thing. So in the 2007 E3 trailer for Resident Evil 5, Shiva Alamar's introduction appears to be a response to the outcry over the racial depictions in that cinematic. Whiteness represents itself as a universal marker for being civilized, and in doing so posits the other within the language of pathology, fear, madness, and degeneration. Dyer contends that white identity is founded upon a paradox, that whiteness entails both individuality and universality, while other races are limited to collateral objectivity. Dyer adds that control over the self and the spirit, over women's bodies, over land, and over others is a hallmark of white identity. This is an important point for considering how video games enact control as an integral part of the gaming experience. Continuing, another difference with games is that as a medium, they're about invoking our fears so that we can overcome them, Johnson speculates. I think that's what happens in both Resident Evil 5 and also Dead Island. They're not just invoking fear of zombies, they're invoking fear of blackness and offering the gamer an opportunity to challenge their racial fears as well as their other fears. What you're seeing here is subconscious action. And the reason it becomes clear is because it's not in one game, it's in several different games. So again, this is touching on a few different things that we're talking about. This idea of like playing out certain things within games. Again, this idea of intentionality, like if we see this dynamic playing itself over and over again in lots of different examples of games, can we still say that, you know, this is unintentional or this is just a representation of history, or do we have to start to think this is demonstrating something more than that? Another game that's obviously interesting to talk about in this sense is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. This has come up a lot in discussions of violence in video games, but it also comes up in discussions of representations of race and gender, whether those representations are, you know, too stereotypical or whether they may actually be authentic. So Grand Theft Auto San Andreas is a game that has received praise and criticism for its representation of race and gender. While it arguably employs racist stereotypes of people of color as violent, some critics argue it depicts people of color as fully developed characters. The GTA franchise has often served as a touchpoint for arguments about racist, sexist, and violent content in games, and has been the center of several studies of representation in games. A different sort of game that reflects trauma experienced by Latinx people in modern-day America, Life is Strange 2, addresses covert racism in a way that is unfortunately relatable for minorities in majority white countries. Protagonists Sean and Daniel Diaz are discriminated against because they don't look like they're from around here and appear dirty. They're treated as adults deserving prosecution instead of as children in need of aid in times where they get into trouble. Sorry, that was a weird transition, but this is from a different game that actually, you know, is intentionally trying to show how racism works in the world, specifically through representation. So then we have another example of a intentional, specific representation of race in Assassin's Creed. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed franchise has dealt with a number of historical settings, which it tries to capture in a manner that is realistic and respectful to the inhabitants of real-world countries. The first game, Assassin's Creed, features Altair ibn Ahad, a Muslim born in Syria during the uprising of the Nizari Islamilis. I don't know how to pronounce that, but hopefully that's close enough. Who's quickly adopted by their high-ranking members after his father dies. Altair's story makes him a hero, and he rises in rank and then fails and is given a chance to prove his worth as an assassin. It's another story that doesn't center his religion or ethnicity as the reason he's in the game. He's just part of the world that the game is set in. And so this is a good example of an authentic representation using the racial signifiers and religious signifiers, identity signifiers in a way that lends itself authentically to the story. Okay, so we've looked at a few different things that kind of show interpretations and statistics. And so there are also studies at the effects of this in the real world. So it's kind of similar to what we talked about last week. We talked about how there have been a lot of studies on whether people who play violent video games are more or less likely to actually commit violent acts in real life. And most of those studies are inconclusive or show that there is no correlation. So similarly, there have been studies to look at whether depictions of video games have real-world consequences, whether they cause real-world violence or antisocial behavior. And some of those studies have shown a relationship there. So from the Grand Theft Auto study, the study finds that players use their own experiences and knowledge to interpret Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. They do not passively receive the game's images and content. The meanings they produce about controversial subjects are situated in players' local practices, identities, and discourse, models as they interact with the game's semiotic domain. The results suggest that scholars need to study players in naturalistic settings if they want to see what effects games are having on players. So this is essentially saying that there's not like a produced effect of violence or racial stereotype or something like that. That players are able to interpret the content for what it is. From another study, without any emotional, geographic, or linguistic connection to Resident Evil 5's rendition of Africa, Shiva is a video game equivalent of Pocahontas, a woman of color coerced into guiding white explorers across a foreign land that she is presumed to be familiar with because of her ethnic heritage. Leonard argues that the representation of black bodies as violent caricatures in video games reproduces fears of black masculinity. From another study, Robert Brookie expands upon this claim. In his analysis of gaming blogs, he discovered overt racist attitudes toward Chinese farmers. More importantly, that some players who harbor negative feelings toward Chinese farmers did not believe that these feelings denote racial discrimination. Thus, though it is the case that players cannot see each other's bodies while playing, specific forms of gamic labor, such as gold farming and selling, as well as specific styles of play, have become racialized as Chinese, producing new forms of networked racism that are particularly easy for players to disavow. So this is kind of saying two interesting things. One, that there's this racial coding that happens without even having the visual racial signifiers of seeing people, but that players are also able to see that and then disavow it. So continuing with another study, thus, we ask a slightly different set of questions regarding video games as learning tools, namely, can video games facilitate learning that is antisocial? Put another way, do the entertainment and interactive aspects of video gaming reproduce common sense ideas about race and gender? Ideas, that is, which can enliven long-standing and problematic notions of racial difference and deviance. The selling and marketing of urban culture is premised on notions of difference that ultimately reproduce rather than contest racial hierarchies. Discussing this very fact, as Craig Watkins writes, that certain types of representations of blackness are more likely to be merchandised, not because they're necessarily real, but rather because they fit neatly with the prevailing common sense characterizations of black life. Thus, hip-hop oriented video games, like other hip-hop oriented media, establish the ideas, values, and behavioral scripts that facilitate how young media users make sense of blackness. So tying into that idea of kind of like commercialism as well. Okay, just a few more quotes. Sorry, these are pretty long. I should kind of try to edit these down a little bit. So another study, results suggest that video game play cultivates real-world beliefs about blacks, such as individuals who spend more time playing video games have less egalitarian views of blacks. Though minority characters appear infrequently in video game content, research suggests that mediated minority stereotypes are repetitive, memorable, and impactful on players' real-world judgment. So this study does see a relationship between representation and what players sort of believe or think in their real life. In the history of video games, LGBT content has been subject to changing rules and regulations, which are generally examples of heterosexism, in that heterosexuality is normalized while homosexuality is subject to additional censorship or ridicule. Companies Nintendo of America, Sega of America, and Maxis police the content of games with content codes in which LGBT themes were toned down or erased. Some Japanese video games, for instance, originally included trans characters such as Birdo from Super Mario Bros. 2, Poison from the Final Fight series, and Flea from Chrono Trigger. Due to the adherence to Nintendo of America's quality standards and translations based on preserving gameplay rather than literal meaning, these characters' identities were altered or erased in translation. So I think this is kind of interesting, going back to what we talked about a few moments ago, of this idea of marketing, where there's this sort of concept that players only want to play a certain type of game. They don't want to play games with women protagonists or LGBT characters. But that's not based on data, so it's not really clear what it is based on, but it's interesting to see these changes being made to games for marketing purposes that aren't based on real-world data. So continuing a little bit in this theme, in 2014, in a harassment campaign dubbed Gamergate, numerous women in the gaming community known for being vocal about the toxicity within the industry were systematically targeted. One of the high-profile women that was targeted during Gamergate was Anita Sarkeesian, founder of Feminist Frequency, a web series and later website where Sarkeesian freely comments on gender, racial, and sexual identity inequalities in the media, including video games. Other women who also experienced targeted harassment as the result of Gamergate were game developers, programmers Zoe Quinn and Brianna Wu, and actress and self-proclaimed gamer Felicia Day. Most of the harassment involved rape threats, death threats, and the distribution of highly private and identifying information, i.e. home addresses, phone numbers, and social security numbers. Excuse me. Also called doxing. Faced with brutal online harassment, many women have felt forced to adopt strategies such as leaving game sessions, disguising their gender, or simply not playing games at all. Okay, so that's a lot. I should probably pare those quotes down a little bit, but I find all that stuff really interesting and worth thinking about. So we have one last discussion question, and it's kind of similar to what we've already talked about, but generally, what is this our responsibility as game designers to consider representations of race and gender in our characters and the game worlds that we make? So sort of asking the same question again, but curious to see what if you guys have thoughts or comments on what we've seen versus what you just generally feel when you're making a game. It's kind of similar to what we talked about with violence, whether or not to include violence. Maybe it's something you don't think about. Maybe it's something you don't think is necessary to consider. But I'm curious what you guys think, if this is something that we should think about when we're creating a game, and if so, what sort of decisions would that lead us to make as game designers? So not really as game players, but more as game designers, how should we think about these issues? Cool, thank you. So yeah, I think that's a couple of good points. This thing that we've talked about with authenticity. So the character should represent the world of the game, but I think it's also a good point that if you do want to represent a game world that you might not know a lot about, that in order to portray it authentically, you do probably have a responsibility to do some research to actually look into the culture, look into the history, and actually learn about what you might be representing and how to do it in an authentic way. So I think that's a great point. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I think that's similar to some of the points we've been talking about just in terms of authenticity. Like if you change the racial signifiers of a character just for the sake of just for the sake of increasing some form of representation, then it's not going to feel authentic, right? It's going to be kind of transparent. So I think that's a good point. It's not enough to just change the skin color or the hairstyle or the clothing of a character. It has to be authentic to the game world. That's okay. You could maybe if you can find it, you could share it in the chat. So So I think, sorry, Gal, I'm gonna just chime in a little bit. Thank you guys for this discussion. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate you guys, speaking and speaking on the topic and making points. I do want to move on just because we only have half an hour left, so I want to make sure to have some workshop time for people to ask questions and work on their projects. But I do think, it's a really interesting conversation. It's something that we can talk about more in the future if you guys are interested in continuing to have that conversation. I do think it's interesting that this sort of idea of authenticity that's seemed to be kind of the main theme from what I can see that's come out of this. And I think you guys have made a lot of really interesting and nuanced points about how kind of breaking authenticity can really ruin the sort of fictional world or the player's experience of a game. And then there's also this other wider conversation, or not necessarily wider, but separate conversation about gamers' experiences. So I think it's really interesting to think about that and think about how other people experience social interaction, interacting online, all of these different things. Because representation in the video game itself is one thing, and we've kind of talked a lot about that, but there's also this more general issue of representation in culture. And I think we've talked a lot about the idea of authenticity, and I think that's you guys have made really good points. I think there's this sort of bigger question of the industry itself. So we can talk about specific games and whether or not they are authentic, but then a lot of these studies are kind of looking at the whole industry and saying there's examples of games that do X or Y, there's examples of games that have good representation of this or that or are very authentic in one way or another. But if you look at all of the games as a whole, you might start to see that why aren't there games that feature this type of protagonist more or something like that. And I actually think that has a lot more to do with the industry who's making games, as we've talked a little bit about. Anyway, I do think that we should kind of move on to having a little bit of workshop time. There was a couple people who had questions. James had a question about tile sets, and Rose also had a question. So I'm gonna meet with them. I guess I'll make some rooms as I've done the last few times, and I guess this time I'll just do random stuff. If you guys want to do the same thing that we've been doing the last few weeks, just talk about what you're working on. We are getting pretty close to the end of the semester, so it would be a good time to talk a little bit about collaborations that you might want to do or other things that you're working on, which actually reminds me, sorry, I'm going to stop my screen share.